Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our weekly tropical weather outlook today, Sunday, March 16th, 2025. We're now halfway through the month of March. Let's get started off with this week's video with, as typical, the NOAA Coral Reef Watch sea surface temperature anomalies. And really not much of a difference compared to what we've been talking about over the last several weeks. We still have a very, very warm tropical Atlantic, although off the coast of Africa, we've seen a cooling in recent weeks, though it's typical, as I mentioned before, we typically have strong trade winds across the Atlantic during the winter and spring months. But it'll be really important to note just how much warming, if we're able to get warming, and I'm sure we will, occur starting probably later this month, especially next month, and especially as we get towards May. And we'll have to see how much warming occurs, but as I said, I'm very confident we'll probably see, especially by the time we get to the late spring and into June, by the time we get to summer and hurricane season. We'll probably see this region, especially the Eastern Atlantic, warm up quite a bit. It happens every single year, so I'm not really too focused on whether or not it's warm or cold right now, especially off of the immediate West African coast all the way in the Eastern Atlantic. We typically don't see activity this far out in the hurricane season early on, anyways, until August or September. The biggest focus really should be, especially for the early season, on the Caribbean and Gulf. And man, has the Caribbean and Gulf remained warm through the entire winter. And now, so far, pretty much as we head into the spring, it's remained warm. And it's important because now, as we're heading into the spring, and obviously we're starting to see more sunlight in the northern hemisphere, you can assure that we will no longer see any substantial cooling of these sea surface temperature anomalies likely typically would, and also the regular sea surface temperatures too, during the winter. From here on out, it's an upward hill for sea surface temperatures across the Atlantic. So pretty much all these anomalies that we have right now, it is I'm pretty sure and I'm pretty confident that these anomalies will probably stick as we head into the spring and summer, unless something drastic happens. And this is very interesting to watch, obviously, for hurricane season, especially the early part of the season, since we watch the Caribbean and Gulf, especially for development, especially in months like June and July, and off the East Coast as well. But also for severe weather, and that has definitely come into play here over the last week or so, especially this weekend so far with our big severe weather outbreak that we had across the South and the Dixie Valley region. We'll go over that in a little bit, and we'll go over what happened and kind of review what's the situation with severe weather in a little bit. But the warmth that we have in the Caribbean and Gulf also plays a factor into severe weather season, and we're definitely seeing that play out right now. So the fact that the Caribbean and Gulf is very warm right now is very important for more things than just one reason. And then meanwhile, in the Pacific, obviously with the ENSO, right along the equatorial Pacific, we've really seen the eastern portion warm up quite a bit over the last several weeks, especially as we got towards the month of March. We kind of have a coastal El Nino setup occurring right now. And then we also are starting to see this slowly advance westward. And the key factor into what we're going to be watching with the Pacific is how much of this warmth retains, and especially does this warmth spread westward and kind of become a basin wide sort of warmth that pretty much means an El Nino type setup as we head into hurricane season, because that'll have its impacts, especially on maybe suppressing the hurricane season a little bit, or maybe is this warmth non-permanent feature that we have right now, and it'll go away and cool down as we get towards the hurricane season, especially as we get towards the peak, and also as we get towards the fall this year, and that'll also have its impacts beyond hurricane season, thinking ahead all the way to winter of this year into next year, but that is very far ahead, and we'll definitely talk about more about that when we get there. And the reason why I mentioned we need to watch whether or not this will persist and maybe warm up further, or maybe is this just something that we have right now and it'll cool down in a few weeks, is because there's a little bit of a disagreement that I'm starting to see, at least among climate models, as we head into the summer about what the future of ENSO will be in the Pacific. And I'll dive into that in just a little bit. But really quickly, I think I did this last week or the week before, did a comparison week by week of how at least this map looked like um, with the NOAA Coral Reef Watch. So I thought maybe let's do, instead of comparing what we had this week to what we had last week and see what changed, how about we compare what we have so far, which is March 15th. So this is the map updated as of yesterday, to how it looked like at the beginning of the month, just to see where we kind of are. And you can see, let's kind of shift back and forth just a little bit so you can get an idea. Kind of the same. Maybe a little bit more cooling occurred in the Atlantic, although once again it still remains very warm, especially through the Caribbean, but especially here in the Pacific. Notice how we have the warmth persistent here from the beginning of March. And if we go from March 1st till now, we've kind of had some of these cooler anomalies more towards the Central Pacific that were a little bit stronger early in the month. Notice how we go from March 1st to the map updated as of yesterday, and notice just how much of these anomalies eroded away. But interestingly, on the other hand, notice how the northern Pacific, especially north of the equator, kind of remains cold too. Lots of definitely mixed signals going on. And right now, March, especially from now over the next several weeks, I really can't stress this enough. Now is really time to watch these signals very closely, because now is the time that we start moving past the uncertainty and unpredictability. And whatever happens in a few weeks, it's going to start becoming very clear, or at least it's going to start forming into the puzzle pieces that'll make what the setup will be for this hurricane season. So it's very interesting to see that we have quite a bit of warmth in the Eastern Pacific, and it's definitely eroded away over the last several weeks as we've progressed into March so far, further west. And you can even see that too with the SOI. I always mention the correlation between ENSO and the SOI. We're in a positive SOI right now, meaning the atmosphere is more or less responding like it would in a La Nina, because the SOI is a measure of pressure patterns in the Pacific. And as we know, the atmospheric pressure definitely has a direct implication on sea surface temperatures. If you're at least somewhat versed in climatology, you would know that to be the case. And we have a positive SOI right now, or at least that's what the case is right now. The 30-day average is 2.5 points, and the 90-day average is holding steady at 5 points. So the SOI is still positive. But notice, especially since last month, the downtrend that we've seen, we were strongly positive, well above 10 points in the 30-day average, and we were above 7 points in the 90-day average. And I mentioned 7 points specifically because, as I mentioned before, that's typically the threshold that we look at for the SOI responding, especially like a La Nina pattern would. And we've come quite a bit downward since last month with the SOI. So we're starting to see a little bit of regulation and kind of fading of the atmosphere, if you will, away from a La Nina pattern, a lot closer towards neutral. But we're still in a positive SOI right now, so we're not necessarily headed towards El Nino. And so that kind of also makes sense as to why we're seeing warming occur, steady warming occur in the Pacific, at least over the last several weeks. And you could see that warmth also not just from these maps here, which is what the sea surface temperature anomalies are on the surface, but I also like to look at these sea surface temperature anomaly maps. This is the depth below the surface, specifically right along the equator. And really quickly, let's wait for this map to start from the beginning. So this starts all the way from early January, and notice how much cold anomalies we had, especially once this, and I think this stopped, so we're going to have to refresh it. But notice, especially from January, we had all these cold anomalies right below the surface of the Pacific, meaning we had a lot of cold anomalies in place for the La Nina that we had as we began this year. And notice just how much of that got eroded away, especially over the last several weeks. And especially is if you notice at the top right corner, a lot more of these warm anomalies beginning to fill in closer to the surface of the ocean in response to all these cold anomalies kind of eroding away. So definitely seeing the ground that we had for the La Nina that we had at the start of the year kind of erode away. And now we have much more of a warmer profile of the equatorial Pacific, not just at the surface, but below the surface too. So that definitely shows how much La Nina has weakened and how much warming we've seen with the ENSO over the last several weeks. But it does get a little interesting because I did see people mention some comparisons to years like 2017 or 2008, or years where we had quite a bit of warming of the ENSO in the spring, but those years still ended up as we got towards the fall. We did not necessarily get towards an El Nino, and I mention that because there's been quite a bit of talk over the last several weeks, especially since the beginning of the year. Everybody's talking about, once we get past this La Nina, are we going to get towards an El Nino? Is the Pacific going to warm up substantially this year? Especially because of what climate models have been showing since the start of this year. But a lot of that's gotten quite a bit uncertain, especially over the last several weeks since we've kind of gotten into March and we've gotten the latest March climate model, I guess, data. And I'll show you that in just a moment, or I'll pretty much show you it right now, because as you could see from the animation I just showed you, and I'll show you it one more time, had quite a bit of cold anomalies in the Pacific, and it's eroded away. But if we actually look at what the ENSO probabilities are, this is the latest March probability of what the ENSO will be as we head towards the rest of the year, and this actually goes out um, all the way to the end of the year. This goes out to the October, November, December time frame. So this is pretty much getting towards the fall and even a little bit into the winter for the end of 2025. And notice the blue bar represents the chance of La Nina. And you notice we see a crash in chances of La Nina occurring, at least over the next several months. And we kind of transition or continue the transition into an ENSO neutral pattern across the Pacific. And by the way, if you're wondering where this map is from, it's from NOAA Climate Prediction Center. So this is the official forecast by NOAA, which is pretty much the biggest institution that we look at when it comes to things like ENSO. So we remain in ENSO neutral, or at least we continue our transition into ENSO neutral as we head towards the next several months, or at least the next several tri-monthly periods. But then notice, especially as we get towards starting around May or June, or at least the June, July, August period, very interestingly enough, the La Nina chances begin to go back up. So much so that at this very last graph here, this is October, November, December. So once again, getting towards the end of the year, look at that. La Nina and neutral chances are pretty much equal. And especially La Nina rises once again above 40%. And I'll even show you as well with the CFS forecast for the ENSO, specifically the Nina 3.4 region in the Pacific, which that's the region that's generally the data point in the Pacific that we look at for ENSO. Notice too, this is the forecast all the way out to, um, again, towards the end of this year. Notice we have quite a bit of warming right now, but the CFS, at least the ensemble mean of the last several runs, because all these little plots you see here, all these lines are runs of the CFS, because this model, the CFS runs every single day. And then we have an ensemble mean that kind of takes the average of all of the runs. And notice where the ensemble mean is too. It actually goes back down a little bit as we head towards the latter part of spring and then into summer, and then pretty much stays right around neutral, if not slightly colder than exactly neutral with the ENSO. And if we actually at least look at the latest forecast members, so the blue lines, notice they trend all the way from decently strong La Nina to some showing a fairly potent El Nino as we head towards the rest of this year. So quite a bit of spread, even in the CFS, with the ensemble mean right at neutral. So not really certain about El Nino either. And this is especially interesting when you compare that to the European forecasts for March, and this is the latest this forecast goes out to. They only go out to July, August, September. And on the flip side, the CFS and the official probabilities from the NOAA are showing colder ENSO, or maybe not very certain on a warmer ENSO. Meanwhile, the European, on the other hand, they have a much warmer look in the Pacific, almost like an El Nino is trying to come along, but not quite. I guess they have more warmer ENSO, but this is getting towards the late summer. This is not necessarily towards the end of the year yet. So maybe if this were to go further along, this will probably eventually progress into an El Nino. But the European, though, there's a little bit of uncertainty with that because the European seasonal model, which is the model that I'm showing you right now, does actually have the tendency to have a warm bias, meaning they tend to show El Nino long in the long range in their climate model forecasts. Even when an El Nino is not going to happen, they still show an El Nino, and it's happened in past several years. Some of them very infamous. So questioning this a little bit, but still, the European is warmer, the CFS is definitely cooler, and so are the official probabilities from NOAA. So quite a bit of uncertainty, and that's typical. It's March. We're not past the spring predictability barrier yet. We don't get past that till we get to next month, which is why I say once again these next several weeks in terms of the evolution of what happens in ENSO and what happens in the Atlantic in terms of how warm the Atlantic is. It's all very important to be paying attention to those signals right now because those are going to help start forming the puzzle pieces that'll fall into place for what the setup will be, what we're going to be looking at for this hurricane season. All things to be keeping in mind over the next several weeks. But beyond that, though, we have obviously our own immediate concerns when it comes to weather in the United States. We just had a pretty significant severe weather outbreak yesterday, and as you can see by the latest watches and warnings, still quite a bit of active weather today. In fact, we still have severe weather ongoing today. Obviously much further east. It's not across the south anymore. They're not dealing with any more of this severe weather. But at least across the southeast, all the way from northern Florida to the Carolinas, and then portions of northern and western Virginia, and also western and central PA, and even portions of far western upstate New York. They're also dealing with severe weather. We have tornado watches in effect, and also severe thunderstorm watches in effect too. There's also some flooding potential for upstate New York and interior New England, especially upstate New York and Vermont. There are flood watches in effect. And as I always mention, don't downplay whenever we have flood watches because, as I always mention, and this is really applicable to all kinds of flooding, but especially when it comes to tropical cyclones, the number one factor in death in a tropical storm or a hurricane is the flooding, not the winds. So in this case, we do have tornado watches, meaning there is the risk for tornadoes, which do obviously cause lots of damage. They're wind damage, pretty much. But you always have to keep in mind for the flooding as well, from the heavy rain that is probably associated with a bunch of these severe storms. So keep that in mind too. We also have bunch of red flag warnings in effect for Texas and portions of the plains. Very dry conditions and very strong gusty winds associated with a very powerful low pressure that's kind of triggering all of this mess of severe weather that we have today, and we had this weekend. We had very strong gusty winds across the plains, once again combined with very dry conditions, and even with those gusty winds, you have a lot of these high wind warnings in effect for portions of Texas and even portions of the western U.S. And they also have their own sort of weather going on. So we have some of these winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories in effect for the western coast. They also have active weather occurring for them as well. So quite a bit of weather happening for everybody right now. But obviously the biggest risk, or the biggest focus, is severe weather today. This is the latest Storm Prediction Center map for day one. A slight risk once again all the way from northern Florida, extends all the way up the East Coast pretty much. Well, not including coastal mid-Atlantic and Northeast, but extending up into Virginia, the Carolinas, and most of Pennsylvania, especially central and western Pennsylvania, where the risk is actually most elevated. There's an enhanced risk in effect for today, so keep that in mind. We have a tornado risk and also wind and hail as well. Although, at least with the tornado risk, it's definitely not as significant as what we had yesterday across the South when we had multiple long track devastating tornadoes. And in fact, here I have a tweet from Ben Knoll. All the way since Friday when we had this significant severe weather outbreak, this whole mess started on Friday. Since then, Ben Knoll just tweeted this morning, 66 tornadoes have been confirmed across 7 states. Obviously, the most being in Mississippi. That's where the kind of epicenter of this outbreak was. We had 29 in Mississippi, we had 13 in Missouri, and we also had several in Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, and Louisiana. And he mentions these numbers will continue to rise, given that we still have severe weather ongoing today, and there's probably still damage to be surveyed that might indicate that other tornadoes happened throughout the weekend. But overall, a very active event that happened, and luckily, this is all going to move out. And I guess in terms of severe weather, we're kind of going to remain on the quiet side with that, or at least as we progress into the week. So let's actually take a look at that with the GFS, kind of going into the future. Very strong low pressure over southeastern Canada. This is kind of what's associated with all this mess, bringing quite a bit of heavy snow to portions of southeastern Canada, while we have rain and severe thunderstorms extending all the way from northern Florida up into the northeast. And then this low pressure moves northward, and then this kind of cold front that we have, this kind of system in the eastern half of the U.S., brings rain to portions of the northeast and New England, all the way down to the Carolinas tonight into tomorrow morning. And then that moves off and becomes a low pressure off the Carolinas and out into the Atlantic and probably impacts Bermuda or someplace like that. And then we have another low pressure, strong low pressure that develops over the central and northern plains, and then it impacts the Midwest. And this is as we head towards the middle half of this upcoming week. And that looks like a pretty significant winter storm once again for portions of Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and then that moves northward into southeastern Canada, probably brings quite a bit of significant snow to southeastern Canada and the Great Lakes regions once again. But at least in terms of weather across the South and in terms of severe weather, you really don't see that much of a outstanding signature for a huge severe weather outbreak. Maybe you might get something, but definitely not as much, not anything like we saw this past weekend, at least as we progress into the rest of the week, this upcoming week. So we're good on the severe weather front, but at least in terms of other weather, we obviously, as we head towards the middle part of next week, looks like we'll have a pretty significant severe weather outbreak for parts of the northern Midwest and the Great Lakes. As we head into Wednesday and Thursday, I guess some rain and maybe some snow for portions of the Northeast and New England as we head into Friday. And then that develops into a low pressure south of Atlantic Canada. And then kind of throughout the week, we have quite a bit of active weather in the Pacific Northwest, going to bring lots of rain and snow to the mountains and along the west coast of Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. So if you're, dealing with precipitation there, especially for these mountain regions in the Pacific Northwest, I guess this will be good for moisture. Even I think for portions of the mountains of Northern California, it's good that we have a lot of snow there because eventually, as that melts, it brings moisture and water that gets transported south across the entirety of California, and that's definitely going to be something that'll build up over the next coming week because we have lots of active weather across the Pacific Northwest. And beyond that, looks like we don't have to deal with severe weather at least for the next upcoming week. So for those cleaning up, which I'm sure there are a lot of people cleaning up from severe weather that we had this weekend, at least you have a week to rest and recover before we have any other severe weather, which there probably will be. We're in March, and it only gets active from here on out. Peak of severe weather tends to be next month and into May. I'd say next month for eastern and central parts of the U.S., and then as we get towards May and June, that's when we typically see severe weather and tornado outbreaks, or at least the tornado outbreak season peak for the plain regions of the United States. So we're just getting started with severe weather. So we have lots to talk about and lots to keep on track over the next several weeks, from severe weather and with hurricane season 2 as we're now heading into mid-March. And before you know it, we're going to be over with March. We're going to get into April. And then once we get through April, we're going to be in May. And then once we get through May, we're going to be in hurricane season. It's like a clock. And it just keeps speeding up, it seems like. But that's how life is. Not much else I could say when it comes to that. But before you know it, we have severe weather, and then we're going to get hurricane season. So lots, once again, to talk about over the next several weeks. And if you want to keep all on top of that, you can definitely, I really recommend to like, comment, subscribe to my channel, because I'll be posting whenever we have any other severe weather outbreaks or whenever we have winter weather too. And especially for hurricane season, I'll be very active throughout hurricane season. Till then, though, I'll continue to do these weekly tropical weather outlooks. So if you want to stay tuned for that and you want to stay tuned for any updates on whenever there's any major weather occurring, would really appreciate if you like, comment, subscribe. Especially if you subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you get whenever I upload my videos the second I upload them. And also, if you have any family and friends that you want to be notified and want to keep them on top of the weather, I very much recommend that you share this video as them and keep them informed, especially if they have any major weather coming their way. Thanks for watching this week's video and today's video. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to all of you. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I'm very sure we'll be talking again very soon.